Southern Mesopotamia is defined by a wide, flat alluvial plain created by the long-term interaction of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This landscape did not exist as a stable entity in deep prehistory. Geological and paleoenvironmental research shows that during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene periods, roughly between 15,000 and 8,000 BCE, these rivers repeatedly shifted their courses, depositing layers of fine silt across the lowlands. Over centuries, this process produced exceptionally fertile soils while also generating marshes, seasonal wetlands, and unstable floodplains. The result was an environment rich in potential agricultural productivity, but demanding in terms of management and foresight. Unlike regions such as Anatolia or the Levant, where rainfall agriculture could support early farming communities, southern Mesopotamia lay beyond the reliable reach of annual precipitation. Average rainfall was insufficient to sustain crops without supplemental water. Archaeological and climatological evidence indicates that human survival in this region depended on access to river water and an understanding of its seasonal behavior. Flooding typically occurred in late spring, driven by snowmelt from the Taurus and Zagros mountains. These floods were irregular in timing and intensity, sometimes nourishing fields, at other times destroying them. This unpredictability created a landscape where passive adaptation was rarely sufficient. Sediment core samples and ancient riverbed mapping reveal that the rivers gradually extended the land southward toward the Persian Gulf, which lay much farther north than it does today. As new land emerged, it remained unstable and often waterlogged. Early human activity tended to concentrate along natural levees formed by repeated flooding. These slightly elevated ridges provided relative protection from inundation while maintaining proximity to water sources. Archaeological surveys consistently show that later settlements, including those of the early Sumerian period, followed these same geographic patterns, indicating long-term continuity in land use strategies. The physical environment also imposed significant material constraints. Southern Mesopotamia lacked accessible stone, timber, and metal ores. These absences shaped economic behavior and encouraged early long-distance exchange with surrounding regions. At the same time, the abundance of clay from river deposits supported the widespread use of mud brick for construction and clay tablets for record-keeping. Geography thus influenced not only subsistence but also architecture, technology, and administrative practices. From an ecological perspective, the region consisted of a patchwork of zones, including riverbanks, flood basins, and marshlands. Each offered different resources, such as fish, reeds, grazing land, and arable soil. Archaeological evidence suggests that early populations exploited this diversity through mixed subsistence strategies, combining hunting, fishing, herding, and limited cultivation. Over time, these practices required coordination, particularly as populations increased and competition for productive land intensified. Managing water flows, clearing canals, and maintaining embankments were tasks that exceeded the capacity of individual households. A key insight from environmental archaeology is that irrigation was not simply a technological innovation, but a social one. The necessity of regulating water across shared landscapes encouraged cooperation and collective decision-making. This requirement distinguished southern Mesopotamia from many other early human habitats. Rather than relying on naturally predictable conditions, inhabitants were compelled to reshape their environment deliberately. This process fostered habits of planning, labor organization, and communal responsibility long before the appearance of cities. The geographic openness of the Mesopotamian plain also shaped its historical trajectory. With few natural barriers, the region remained accessible to movement and interaction from multiple directions. This openness facilitated cultural exchange and technological diffusion while also exposing settlements to external pressures. Geography, therefore, did not determine outcomes rigidly, but it created a framework within which human choices carried long-term consequences. This complex and demanding environment explains why early human groups were drawn to the land between the rivers despite its risks. The combination of fertility and instability rewarded innovation and coordination, setting conditions that would later support permanent settlement agricultural intensification, and increasingly complex social structures. Over time, the need to respond actively to this landscape encouraged new solutions, forming the environmental foundation upon which the earliest stages of Mesopotamian society would develop. Archaeological evidence indicates that human presence in Mesopotamia long predates the emergence of agriculture and permanent settlement. Before 9000 BCE, the region was occupied intermittently by mobile hunter-gatherer groups whose movements followed seasonal resources rather than fixed locations. These populations left behind stone tools, temporary campsites, and faunal remains that collectively reveal patterns of subsistence and mobility. Although their material traces are less visible than those of later farming communities, they represent an essential phase in the long human engagement with the Mesopotamian landscape. Lithic assemblages recovered from sites across northern and central Mesopotamia, as well as along the fringes of the southern alluvial plain, demonstrate technological continuity with wider Paleolithic and Epipaleolithic traditions of Southwest Asia. Microlithic blades, scrapers, and projectile points reflect hunting strategies adapted to diverse environments, including open steppe, riverine corridors, and marshlands. The consistent use of similar tool forms across large areas suggests sustained interaction between groups inhabiting Mesopotamia, the Zagros foothills, and the Levant. These connections allowed knowledge, raw materials, and technological practices to circulate well before the rise of settled communities. Faunal remains from pre-Neolithic contexts indicate a broad-spectrum subsistence strategy. Early inhabitants hunted wild cattle, gazelle, and onager, while also exploiting fish, birds, and small mammals available in wetland environments. Botanical evidence, though limited, suggests the gathering of wild cereals and legumes in nearby upland zones. This flexible approach to subsistence reduced dependence on any single resource and allowed populations to adjust to environmental fluctuations. Over time, repeated engagement with particular plant and animal species contributed to a growing familiarity with their life cycles, habitats, and seasonal availability. Seasonal mobility characterized these early groups. Campsites were typically occupied for short periods, often near water sources or along migration routes of game animals. Archaeological stratigraphy shows repeated use of favorable locations over generations, indicating a growing spatial awareness of the landscape. Although these groups did not construct permanent architecture, the recurrence of activity in specific areas suggests the emergence of territorial familiarity rather than random movement. This pattern laid the groundwork for later decisions to remain in one place for longer durations. Mesopotamia's position between ecological zones played a crucial role in shaping early human behavior. The region acted as a corridor linking upland and lowland environments, enabling access to a wide range of resources. Cultural similarities observed in stone tool technologies and ornamentation point to interaction with communities in the Zagros Mountains and the Levantine Corridor. These exchanges did not require permanent settlement, but relied on social networks maintained through movement and seasonal gathering. Such networks later facilitated the spread of agricultural knowledge and domesticated species. One significant insight from this period is that the transition to farming was not abrupt. Archaeological evidence suggests that long before cultivation began, hunter-gatherers were actively managing their environments. Practices such as selective harvesting, controlled burning, and the repeated use of favored plant stands likely influenced local ecologies. These actions increased resource predictability and reduced risk, making longer stays in certain locations more viable. In this sense, early human groups were already shaping their surroundings, even without formal agriculture. The importance of this phase lies in the accumulation of ecological knowledge rather than material permanence. By observing river behavior, animal migration patterns, and plant growth cycles, these populations developed an understanding of the Mesopotamian environment that later generations would inherit. This inherited knowledge informed decisions about where to settle, which crops to cultivate, and how to manage water and land. As climatic conditions gradually stabilized after the end of the last ice age, the experience gained during this long period of mobility made experimentation with cultivation both possible and attractive, marking the beginning of a fundamental shift in human organization. Around 9700 BCE, the Near East experienced a significant climatic transition that marked the beginning of the Holocene epoch. Paleoclimatic evidence derived from ice cores, lake sediments, and pollen analysis indicates a general warming trend following the end of the last glacial period. Temperatures rose, seasonal extremes moderated, and precipitation patterns became more stable across much of Southwest Asia. These changes altered vegetation zones, expanding grasslands and encouraging the growth of wild cereals in upland regions. For human populations, the new climate reduced environmental volatility and increased the predictability of food resources. In many parts of the Near East, particularly the Levant and the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, these conditions supported early experimentation with plant cultivation. Archaeobotanical remains show increasing human interaction with wild wheat, barley, and legumes, along with selective harvesting practices that gradually favored domesticated varieties. Longer seasonal stays became possible as food resources could be anticipated and managed with greater confidence. Over time, this led to semi-sedentary communities and, eventually, fully established agricultural villages. Southern Mesopotamia, however, followed a different trajectory. Despite the broader climatic improvements, the region remained dominated by marshes, shallow lakes, and unstable river channels. Rising temperatures increased river discharge through enhanced snowmelt in distant mountain ranges, intensifying flooding rather than immediately improving agricultural conditions. Paleoenvironmental reconstructions suggest that much of the southern plain was either waterlogged or subject to unpredictable inundation during the early Holocene. These conditions limited the feasibility of early cultivation and discouraged permanent settlement in the lowlands. This delay is a critical factor in understanding later Sumerian development. While upland regions adopted agriculture earlier through rainfall-based systems, southern Mesopotamia required extensive environmental modification before farming could be sustained. Human groups continued to rely on flexible subsistence strategies, combining fishing, hunting, and seasonal gathering. Rather than lagging in innovation, these communities were accumulating experience with wetland environments and river management. This knowledge would later prove essential when conditions became favorable for large-scale irrigation. Vegetation patterns in the region also evolved more slowly. Pollen data indicates that while grasses expanded elsewhere, dense reed beds and aquatic plants dominated the southern plain. These environments supported abundant animal life and provided raw materials such as reeds for construction and tools, but they were poorly suited to early cereal cultivation. As a result, southern Mesopotamia did not simply adopt agricultural practices from neighboring regions. Instead, it developed its own approach, adapted to local conditions and constraints. One important insight from this period is that environmental opportunity does not translate directly into immediate cultural change. The Holocene shift created potential, but realization depended on local geography and accumulated knowledge. In southern Mesopotamia, the delay in agricultural adoption prevented the early formation of small, rain-fed villages typical of the Levant. This absence later allowed for a more rapid transition from dispersed communities to large, irrigation-based settlements once water control techniques improved. By the later Holocene, gradual sediment deposition and changing river dynamics began to stabilize portions of the southern plain. As marshes receded in some areas and natural levees expanded, opportunities for cultivation increased. Human groups already familiar with the rhythms of rivers and wetlands were well positioned to exploit these changes. The climatic stabilization of the Holocene thus did not immediately produce farming in southern Mesopotamia, but it set in motion a sequence of environmental transformations that eventually made permanent settlement viable. Once these conditions aligned, the accumulated experience of earlier populations enabled the formation of enduring villages, marking the next stage in the region's social and economic evolution. By the 7th millennium BCE, a gradual but consequential transformation was underway across parts of Mesopotamia. Communities that had long relied on hunting, gathering, and seasonal mobility began to incorporate cultivated plants and domesticated animals into their subsistence strategies. Archaeobotanical evidence from sites in northern Mesopotamia and the Zagros foothills demonstrates the presence of domesticated barley and wheat varieties, identifiable through changes in grain morphology and harvesting scars. Zooarchaeological data similarly reveal shifts in animal populations, with sheep and goats increasingly managed by humans rather than hunted in the wild. These developments did not represent a sudden rupture with earlier lifeways, but rather a prolonged period of experimentation and adjustment. Early agricultural activity in Mesopotamia is best understood as part of a wider regional process rather than an isolated invention. Sites such as Jarmo, dating to approximately 7000 BCE, illustrate mixed economies in which cultivated crops supplemented traditional food sources. At Jarmo, remains of domesticated cereals appear alongside evidence of hunting and gathering, suggesting that early farmers retained flexible strategies to mitigate risk. Similar patterns are observed at sites along the upper Euphrates, where small communities adopted cultivation gradually, adjusting techniques to local environmental conditions. This measured pace reflects the challenges of early farming, including crop failure, soil exhaustion, and the need for new forms of labor organization. Southern Mesopotamia presented distinct obstacles to early agriculture. Unlike the rain-fed zones of northern Mesopotamia and the Levant, the southern plain received insufficient rainfall to support crops reliably. Archaeological and environmental studies indicate that successful cultivation in this region required deliberate water management from the outset. Seasonal flooding offered potential benefits, but only if water could be controlled and distributed effectively. This necessity explains why Mesopotamian farming came to rely more heavily on irrigation than on natural precipitation. The earliest irrigation systems were modest, consisting of small channels and diversion ditches that extended water from riverbanks into nearby fields. The adoption of agriculture had profound consequences for human organization. Cultivated fields required sustained attention throughout the growing season, limiting the feasibility of long-distance mobility. As a result, populations began to remain in one place for longer periods, returning year after year to the same plots of land. Storage facilities for surplus grain, identified through architectural remains and large ceramic vessels, further anchored communities to specific locations. These surpluses reduced vulnerability to seasonal shortages and supported modest population growth, as food production became more predictable. Domesticated animals also played a critical role in this transition. Sheep and goats provided meat, milk, and secondary products such as wool, increasing the efficiency of food production. Their management required knowledge of breeding cycles, grazing patterns, and seasonal movement, reinforcing the importance of planning and coordination. Over time, herding complemented cultivation, creating a diversified subsistence base that could absorb environmental shocks. This combination of farming and animal husbandry marked a decisive shift from earlier foraging economies. One of the key insights of this period is that agriculture did not immediately produce social complexity. Early farming communities remained relatively small, and social differentiation was limited. However, the economic foundation was changing in ways that made later developments possible. By generating surplus, these communities could support individuals engaged in activities beyond food production, such as toolmaking or construction. Although specialization remained minimal at this stage, the conditions for its emergence were being established. The spread of agriculture across Mesopotamia also illustrates how environmental constraints shaped cultural choices. In regions where rainfall was sufficient, cultivation could expand with minimal infrastructure. In the southern lowlands, by contrast, irrigation tied agricultural success to collective effort. Maintaining channels, clearing silt, and allocating water required cooperation among households. This necessity encouraged early forms of communal organization and decision-making, foreshadowing the administrative systems that would later characterize Mesopotamian societies. By 600 BCE, agriculture had become a stable component of life in many parts of Mesopotamia, though its intensity and form varied by region. The combination of domesticated plants and animals reduced reliance on wild resources and allowed communities to invest in more permanent structures. Over time, this shift from foraging to farming created the conditions for enduring settlement, setting the stage for the emergence of stable villages and increasingly complex social arrangements in the centuries that followed. As agriculture became a dependable component of subsistence, human communities in Mesopotamia began to organize themselves into stable villages. Archaeological evidence from early Neolithic sites indicates a shift from temporary camps to permanent or semi-permanent dwellings constructed primarily from mud brick. These structures were typically rectangular or oval, with walls built from sun-dried bricks made of local clay. The choice of mud brick reflects both environmental availability and growing investment in place. Unlike temporary shelters, these houses required maintenance and periodic rebuilding, reinforcing long-term attachment to specific locations. Village layouts reveal increasing levels of planning and cooperation. Houses were often arranged in clusters, suggesting occupation by extended family groups or closely related households. Shared courtyards and open spaces appear in many early settlements, providing areas for food processing, tool manufacture, and social interaction. Storage facilities, including pits and large ceramic containers, are frequently found within or adjacent to dwellings. These features indicate the accumulation and management of surplus food, a practice that altered daily routines and social expectations. Managing stored resources required trust, cooperation, and emerging norms regarding access and distribution. Kinship played a central role in early village organization. Although direct evidence for social relationships is limited, burial practices and housing patterns suggest that family ties structured much of daily life. Burials were often located beneath house floors or within domestic compounds, reinforcing connections between the living and the dead. This practice indicates an emphasis on lineage and continuity, as households maintained claims to space and resources across generations. Such arrangements contributed to social stability, even in the absence of formal political institutions. Labor division within early villages was primarily based on age and experience rather than rigid social classes. Archaeological indicators suggest that tasks such as cultivation, herding, food preparation, and construction were shared among community members. While some individuals likely possessed specialized knowledge, particularly in toolmaking or building, there is little evidence of full-time specialization at this stage. Instead, most households participated in a broad range of productive activities. This flexible organization allowed villages to respond to environmental uncertainty and seasonal demands. Communal labor was essential to village survival. Activities such as field preparation, harvesting, and maintenance of irrigation channels required coordinated effort beyond individual households. The need to schedule work and allocate labor reshaped social relationships, encouraging collective decision-making and shared responsibility. Over time, this cooperation fostered informal leadership roles, often based on experience or skill rather than inherited authority. These early forms of leadership were situational and limited, reflecting practical needs rather than permanent hierarchies. Material culture from early villages also reflects emerging social differentiation, though on a modest scale. Variations in house size, construction quality, and the presence of certain tools or ornaments suggest differences in wealth or status. However, these distinctions were not pronounced, and there is no clear evidence of institutionalized inequality. Instead, social differences appear fluid and context-dependent. This relative equality helped maintain cohesion within small communities, reducing internal conflict during a period of significant economic change. One important insight from this phase is that village life required new forms of social regulation. As populations grew and resources were stored rather than immediately consumed, disputes over access and labor likely increased. While formal laws did not yet exist, shared norms and traditions provided mechanisms for conflict resolution. These informal systems laid the groundwork for later legal and administrative developments. By the late Neolithic, villages had become centers of economic and social life, anchoring populations to the landscape. The combination of permanent housing, surplus storage, and cooperative labor transformed social relationships, shifting emphasis from mobility to continuity. These early social frameworks were not yet complex, but they established patterns of cooperation and organization that could be scaled up. As villages expanded in size and number, the demands of managing land, water, and labor increased, necessitating more structured approaches to resource management in the next phase of Mesopotamian development. As early farming communities became more established in Mesopotamia, the management of water emerged as a central challenge and opportunity. Rainfall alone was insufficient to sustain crops in many areas, particularly in the lowlands, where precipitation was unpredictable and often inadequate. In response, communities began experimenting with methods to divert and control river water. Archaeological evidence from the late Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods indicates the construction of simple canals, ditches, and embankments designed to extend water from natural channels into cultivated fields. These early efforts marked a significant departure from reliance on natural conditions toward deliberate environmental engineering. One of the most informative sites for understanding early irrigation is Chogamami, located in eastern Mesopotamia and dating to the 6th millennium BCE. Excavations at the site revealed a network of small canals associated with cultivated fields, demonstrating intentional water diversion. Botanical remains from Chogamami show increased yields of domesticated cereals, particularly barley, which tolerates wetter and more saline conditions better than wheat. This evidence suggests that early farmers were already adjusting crop choices in response to the effects of irrigation, indicating an awareness of both its benefits and limitations. The construction and maintenance of irrigation systems required coordinated labor. Digging channels, clearing silt, and repairing breaches were tasks that extended beyond individual households. These activities demanded planning, scheduling, and cooperation, often on a seasonal basis. Archaeological patterns indicate that irrigation works were shared resources rather than private installations. Control of water, therefore, became a collective concern, reinforcing social bonds while also introducing new potential sources of tension. Decisions about water allocation and maintenance likely influenced emerging leadership roles within communities. Irrigation significantly increased agricultural productivity by expanding the area of cultivable land and reducing dependence on erratic rainfall. Surplus production supported larger populations and encouraged longer-term settlement. However, these benefits came with unintended consequences. One of the most significant was soil salinization. In arid environments, irrigation water evaporates rapidly, leaving behind dissolved salts that accumulate in the soil. Over time, this process reduces crop yields and can render fields unproductive. Archaeological and textual evidence from later periods indicates that salinization became a persistent problem in southern Mesopotamia, but its origins can be traced to these early experiments. Early farmers may not have fully understood the long-term chemical processes involved, but they recognized declining productivity in certain areas. The increased reliance on barley over wheat in irrigated zones provides a clear example of adaptive response. Barley's greater salt tolerance allowed cultivation to continue even as soil conditions deteriorated. This shift illustrates a key insight of early irrigation. Technological solutions often require ongoing adjustment and generate new challenges that must be managed over time. Water control also reshaped the physical landscape. Canals altered natural drainage patterns, redirected sediment, and created artificial boundaries across the plain. Over successive generations, these modifications accumulated, producing landscapes that were increasingly shaped by human decisions rather than natural processes alone. This transformation represents one of the earliest examples of large-scale environmental engineering in human history. The land between the rivers was becoming a constructed environment, maintained through continuous human effort. The social implications of irrigation were as significant as the environmental ones. Shared dependence on water infrastructure encouraged collective identities and reinforced the importance of cooperation. At the same time, the need to regulate access introduced the possibility of conflict. Disputes over water use, maintenance responsibilities, and land boundaries likely became more common as irrigation networks expanded. These pressures contributed to the gradual development of norms, customs, and informal authorities tasked with managing shared resources. A critical realization from this phase is that irrigation did more than increase food production. By organizing labor around water management, early communities inadvertently created the foundations of administrative coordination. Keeping canals functional required record-keeping, scheduling, and oversight, even if these were initially informal. This organizational capacity would later be formalized in temples and governing institutions. By the end of the Chalcolithic period, experimentation with water control had demonstrated both the possibilities and the risks of engineered agriculture. Communities that mastered irrigation could support larger populations and more permanent settlements, but they also became tied to systems requiring constant maintenance and collective management. Successful water control thus enabled population concentration and laid the groundwork for increasingly complex settlements, forming a direct link between early village life and the proto-urban growth that followed. Between approximately 5,300 and 4,000 BCE, southern Mesopotamia entered a phase of development known to archaeologists as the Ubaid period. This era is defined less by sudden technological breakthroughs than by the emergence of a remarkably consistent material culture across a wide geographic area. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Eridu, Al-Ubaid, and Tel el-Weli reveal shared pottery styles, standardized house plans, and similar burial practices. These common features indicate a level of cultural cohesion that extended far beyond individual villages, linking communities across the southern alluvial plain. Ubaid pottery provides one of the clearest markers of this cultural unity. Vessels were typically wheel-made or carefully hand-formed, decorated with simple geometric patterns in dark paint on light backgrounds. These designs appear with little regional variation, suggesting shared aesthetic norms and possibly shared production techniques. The widespread distribution of similar pottery types implies regular interaction among settlements, whether through exchange, movement of craftspeople, or shared traditions passed down across generations. Pottery was not merely utilitarian. Its consistency reflects common practices of food preparation, storage, and consumption that reinforced social identity. Architecture during the Ubaid period further illustrates increasing uniformity. Houses were generally rectangular, constructed from mud brick, and organized around central halls or courtyards. This tripartite house plan appears at numerous sites, indicating a shared understanding of domestic space. The repeated use of similar layouts suggests that households followed established conventions rather than improvising independently. Such standardization points to stable social norms and expectations governing family life, property, and daily activity. Over time, these architectural choices shaped how people interacted within households and neighborhoods. Burial practices also reveal patterns of cultural cohesion. Ubaid graves were typically simple, with the deceased placed in a flexed position and accompanied by modest grave goods, such as pottery vessels or personal ornaments. The relative uniformity of these burials suggests shared beliefs about death and the afterlife, though without strong evidence for elaborate ritual or pronounced social stratification. Differences in grave goods exist, but remain limited, indicating that while social distinctions were emerging, they were not yet rigidly defined. This balance between similarity and variation reflects a society in transition, developing shared values while accommodating local differences. The spread of Ubaid culture beyond southern Mesopotamia highlights its broader influence. Archaeological evidence shows Ubaid-style pottery and architecture appearing in northern Mesopotamia and along the Persian Gulf. In some regions, local traditions persisted alongside Ubaid elements, suggesting a process of cultural interaction rather than wholesale replacement. This expansion demonstrates that Ubaid culture was adaptable, capable of integrating with existing practices while maintaining core features. Such flexibility contributed to its longevity and reach. One important insight from the Ubaid period is that cultural integration preceded political centralization. There is no clear evidence of powerful states or centralized authority during this time. Instead, cohesion appears to have been maintained through shared practices, economic interdependence, and possibly ritual activities centered on communal spaces. Temples, though still relatively modest, began to appear as focal points within settlements. These structures likely coordinated communal labor and resource distribution, reinforcing shared identities without formal governance. The Ubaid period laid essential cultural foundations for later Sumerian civilization. By establishing common ways of building, producing goods, and organizing domestic life, it created a framework that could support larger populations and more complex interactions. Shared material culture reduced friction between communities, facilitating exchange and cooperation across the region. This cohesion was particularly important in an environment that demanded collective management of water and land. As settlements grew in size and density during the later Ubaid phases, the advantages of cultural unity became increasingly apparent. Common norms simplified coordination, enabling communities to undertake larger projects and sustain more complex social arrangements. These developments did not yet constitute urbanism, but they created conditions in which cities could emerge. Cultural unity thus supported the transition from dispersed villages to larger and more interconnected settlements, setting the stage for the urban transformation that would define the next phase of Mesopotamian history. During the Ubaid period, a new form of communal institution began to take shape in southern Mesopotamia, the temple. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Eridu reveal some of the earliest known temple structures, built on raised platforms and repeatedly rebuilt over generations. These buildings were distinct from domestic architecture in both scale and placement, signaling their special role within the settlement. While later Mesopotamian temples would become monumental, early Ubaid temples were relatively modest, yet their functions were already significant. They served not only as religious spaces, but also as centers for organizing economic and social life. The religious role of these early temples is evident from their layout and location. Positioned at prominent points within settlements, temples likely functioned as places where communal rituals were performed and shared beliefs reinforced. Although direct evidence of specific religious practices is limited, the repeated rebuilding of temples on the same spot suggests a strong sense of sacred continuity. This continuity helped anchor collective identity, linking the community's present activities with its past and its perceived relationship to supernatural forces believed to govern fertility, water, and land. Beyond their ritual significance, temples played a central role in economic coordination. Archaeological evidence points to their involvement in the collection, storage, and redistribution of surplus goods. Large storage rooms, standardized containers, and concentrations of food remains near temple complexes suggest that agricultural products were pooled at these locations. This system allowed communities to manage surplus more effectively, smoothing out seasonal shortages and supporting communal projects. By centralizing resources, temples reduced individual risk while increasing collective resilience. Labor organization was another critical function associated with temples. Irrigation maintenance, construction projects, and agricultural tasks often required coordinated effort beyond the capacity of individual households. Temples likely acted as organizing centers where labor was mobilized and directed. Although there is no evidence of formal bureaucracies at this stage, the regular coordination of work implies emerging administrative practices. Individuals associated with temple activities may have held authority based on experience, ritual knowledge, or trust rather than hereditary power. An important insight from this development is that religious authority and economic management were closely intertwined. In early Mesopotamian communities, separating spiritual concerns from practical ones was neither possible nor desirable. Control over resources and labor was legitimized through religious association, reinforcing compliance and cooperation. Temples provided a framework within which communal obligations could be framed as sacred duties, strengthening social cohesion without the need for coercive enforcement. The rise of temple-centered organization did not eliminate household autonomy, but it did introduce a new layer of collective oversight. Families continued to manage their own fields and livestock, yet participation in communal projects became increasingly necessary. This balance between local independence and central coordination allowed settlements to grow without immediately developing rigid hierarchies. Social differentiation remained limited, but the foundations of institutional authority were being established. The presence of temples also influenced settlement structure. As focal points of activity, they attracted population density around them, contributing to more nucleated communities. Over time, this concentration supported the growth of specialized activities, such as craft production and long-distance exchange, which benefited from centralized organization. Temples thus acted as catalysts for increased complexity, even before the emergence of formal political institutions. By the later stages of the Ubaid period, temples had become enduring features of Mesopotamian settlements. Their roles in ritual, storage, and labor coordination represented an early form of institutional authority that prefigured later state systems. Although these institutions lacked the coercive power of kingship, they demonstrated how shared belief and economic necessity could combine to organize large groups of people. This institutional coordination made it possible to sustain larger populations and undertake more ambitious projects, enabling settlements to expand in size and complexity as Mesopotamia moved closer to its urban future. By the late Ubaid period, evidence increasingly points to the emergence of social differentiation within Mesopotamian communities. Although early villages had operated with relatively egalitarian structures, the accumulation of surplus, coordination of labor, and development of communal institutions such as temples created conditions in which certain individuals or households could acquire greater influence. Archaeological indicators, including variations in housing size, construction quality, and associated grave goods, suggest that distinctions in wealth, status, and authority were beginning to take shape, marking the initial stages of a stratified society. Housing patterns provide some of the clearest evidence for emerging social differentiation. Excavations at sites such as Eridu and Tel al-Abaid reveal notable variation in house dimensions and complexity. Larger, more carefully constructed dwellings, sometimes featuring multiple rooms and durable materials, appear alongside smaller, simpler homes. These differences likely reflect disparities in access to resources, labor, and social connections. While all households participated in essential subsistence activities, those with larger or more elaborate houses may have held greater authority in community decision-making or enjoyed enhanced economic advantages. Grave goods similarly illustrate early inequalities. Burials associated with wealthier households often contain more or higher quality artifacts, including decorated pottery, personal ornaments, and tools. In contrast, the majority of graves feature minimal offerings, indicating a distinction between ordinary members of the community and those with elevated status. Although these differences were not yet formalized into rigid classes, they reveal the first visible signs of economic and social stratification. Such distinctions would become increasingly pronounced in subsequent periods, forming the basis for elite classes in later urban centers. Craft specialization also contributed to social differentiation. Evidence from Ubaid settlements indicates the production of finely made ceramics, figurines, and stone tools, suggesting that certain individuals devoted extended time and expertise to specific tasks. Specialized craftsmen may have gained prestige through skill or the ability to provide high-quality goods for communal or ritual use. The concentration of these activities in particular households or workshop areas hints at an early division of labor beyond the subsistence level, reflecting both economic and social complexity. Leadership roles began to emerge in response to the increasing need for coordination. The management of irrigation channels, communal construction projects, and temple activities required oversight. Archaeological patterns suggest that individuals who could organize labor, maintain social cohesion, or possess specialized knowledge likely assumed informal authority. These early leaders did not yet exercise the formalized, hereditary power seen in later city-states, but their influence was recognized and respected within the community. Leadership was situational, contingent upon skills, experience, or social networks, rather than strictly inherited. An important insight from this phase is that inequality and leadership were closely linked to resource management and labor organization. Those who controlled surplus, coordinated irrigation, or oversaw temple activities gained not only practical power, but also social prestige. Authority was thus embedded in everyday economic and ritual activity, reinforcing emerging hierarchies without requiring coercion. This integration of economic, social, and ritual authority established patterns that would later support more formalized governance structures. These developments also had broader implications for settlement growth. Communities with emerging elites and specialized craftsmen were better equipped to mobilize labor for large-scale projects, whether maintaining irrigation systems or constructing communal buildings. The presence of recognized leadership facilitated coordination across households, enabling larger population concentrations and denser settlement layouts. In combination with shared material culture and temple-centered organization, social differentiation created a framework capable of supporting increasingly complex communities. By the end of the Ubaid period, Mesopotamian society was transitioning from largely egalitarian villages to communities marked by social distinctions, leadership roles, and specialized production. While hierarchy remained relatively fluid, these early inequalities foreshadowed the more formal stratification that would define the Sumerian city-states. The interplay between surplus management, craft specialization, and emergent authority established mechanisms of organization and control that would underpin urban development. These social innovations set the stage for true urbanization, demonstrating how economic, religious, and cultural factors combined to create the first proto-urban societies in the ancient Near East. After 400 BCE, southern Mesopotamia witnessed a transformation that historians and archaeologists identify as the urban revolution. Among the most prominent examples of this change is the city of Uruk, which grew rapidly to become one of the largest and most complex settlements of its time. Archaeological excavations revealed densely packed housing, monumental public buildings, and evidence of extensive craft production and trade networks. Uruk exemplifies the transition from dispersed villages to true urban centers, where population density, social complexity, and centralized administration converged in unprecedented ways. The city's growth was fueled by several interrelated factors. First, the intensification of agriculture through irrigation allowed communities to support far larger populations than ever before. Canal networks diverted river water across extensive fields, increasing the predictability and quantity of food production. Surplus production not only fed larger populations, but also freed some individuals to engage in specialized crafts, trade, or administration. This specialization, in turn, reinforced the city's capacity for economic and technological innovation. Archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological evidence from Uruk indicates sustained cereal cultivation and managed herding, supporting an increasingly urbanized lifestyle. Monumental architecture emerged as a defining feature of Uruk. Large mud brick temples, known as ziggurats in later periods, began as elevated platforms associated with religious and administrative functions. The Iana district, for example, contains evidence of extensive rebuilding over centuries, with structures designed to house not only ritual activity, but also storage for agricultural surplus. These buildings required organized labor, planning, and sustained oversight, illustrating the capacity of early urban communities to mobilize resources at an unprecedented scale. Public spaces and specialized workshops within the city indicate an environment where social, economic, and religious life were increasingly intertwined. Population density at Uruk was remarkable for its time. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of inhabitants, living in tightly arranged neighborhoods built along streets and courtyards. This density created pressures for social coordination, sanitation, and conflict resolution, leading to increasingly complex administrative structures. Clay tablets inscribed with proto-cuneiform symbols, dating to the late Uruk period, provide evidence of record-keeping related to trade, labor, and resource distribution. These administrative tools were essential for managing the logistical challenges of urban life, marking a significant step toward formal governance. Craft specialization was a critical component of urban society. Excavations reveal workshops producing pottery, stone tools, textiles, and metal goods, often concentrated in specific districts. Specialized production not only improved efficiency, but also facilitated trade both within the city and with distant regions. Luxury items, such as finely decorated ceramics and shell ornaments, indicate both wealth accumulation and the emergence of social differentiation. The combination of craft specialization, population density, and surplus management created the conditions for complex economic networks unprecedented in prehistory. Trade played a central role in supporting Uruk's urban expansion. The city imported raw materials not locally available, such as timber from the Zagros Mountains, stone from distant uplands, and shells from the Persian Gulf. These exchanges required coordination, negotiation, and reliable transport, further demonstrating the organizational capacity of urban communities. Markets, whether formal or informal, became central nodes where surplus goods, craft products, and food resources circulated, integrating the city into a broader regional economy. An important insight from Uruk's rise is that urbanization was not simply a demographic phenomenon, but a comprehensive social transformation. The convergence of agriculture, craft specialization, monumental construction, trade, and administrative oversight reshaped daily life, creating a society in which collective organization became both necessary and routine. Authority, while still partially grounded in ritual and communal norms, increasingly extended to practical coordination of labor, resources, and infrastructure. The emergence of Uruk and other early southern Mesopotamian cities can be attributed to a combination of environmental, economic, and social factors. Fertile alluvial soils, predictable water management through irrigation, and the accumulation of cultural knowledge from previous millennia provided the material basis for urban growth. Shared traditions, standardized material culture, and the coordination of temple-based institutions facilitated cooperation at scales that smaller villages could not achieve. These elements converged uniquely in southern Mesopotamia, making it the first region to support large, complex urban centers. By the end of this early urban phase, Uruk had become a densely inhabited, socially complex, and economically integrated city. Monumental architecture, administrative innovations, craft specialization, and trade networks distinguished it from surrounding villages. The city's success illustrates how southern Mesopotamia's particular environmental and social conditions fostered the first true urban society. This concentration of population and resources set the stage for the emergence of proto-state structures, formalized governance, and the further development of Sumerian civilization. The development of writing in southern Mesopotamia represents one of the most significant innovations of early urban society. Evidence suggests that writing emerged gradually during the late Uruk period, around 3400 to 3100 BCE, as a practical solution to the increasing administrative demands of growing cities. Initially, small clay tokens of varying shapes and sizes were used to represent quantities of goods, such as grain, livestock, or craft materials. These tokens were stored in clay envelopes, or bulli, and served as tangible records of economic transactions. Over time, the need for more detailed and flexible record-keeping led to the abstraction of these symbols into pictographic signs pressed directly onto clay tablets, the earliest form of what would become cuneiform writing. Writing in this context was fundamentally functional. Archaeologists have found thousands of early tablets documenting deliveries, inventories, and labor assignments. Far from being literary or ceremonial at the outset, these records facilitated the management of surplus resources, coordinated large-scale irrigation projects, and ensured equitable distribution of goods across increasingly complex urban communities. By encoding quantities, names, and commodities, writing enabled administrators to oversee tasks that would have been impossible to manage reliably through memory or oral instruction alone. The innovation reflects an intimate connection between technology and social necessity. The transition from tokens to pictographs illustrates both cognitive and practical advances. Tokens represented discrete items, but as economies expanded and transactions became more diverse, this system reached its limits. Pictographic writing allowed for representation of abstract concepts, such as labor, ownership, and obligation, not just physical goods. Archaeological evidence from Uruk shows tablets documenting workers assigned to fields, rations allocated to laborers, and records of incoming raw materials. These early administrative texts demonstrate that writing was designed to systematize human activity, providing an enduring, portable, and verifiable record of social and economic relationships. Labor organization benefited directly from the emergence of writing. Large urban populations required coordinated work on public projects, such as canal maintenance, temple construction, and communal storage facilities. Written lists, accounts, and labor rosters allowed officials to assign tasks, track contributions, and ensure accountability. This capacity for structured oversight reinforced communal institutions, including temple authorities, which often served as the primary administrators of urban resources. By formalizing the management of work and goods, writing enhanced the efficiency of complex settlements and reduced potential conflicts over resource allocation. Trade, both local and long-distance, was another sphere in which writing proved indispensable. Southern Mesopotamian cities engaged in exchanges that extended to the Zagros Mountains, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. Clay tablets recorded quantities of imported materials such as timber, stone, and shells, facilitating negotiations and providing legal documentation of transactions. Standardized measurements and symbols allowed traders from different communities to communicate effectively, reducing misunderstandings and supporting trust in economic relations. This system reflects the adaptability of early writing to multiple domains, extending its utility beyond immediate administrative needs. An important insight from this period is that writing and administration were mutually reinforcing. As urban populations expanded, written records became necessary for managing resources. At the same time, the presence of records enabled more sophisticated economic and social organization. This feedback loop accelerated the development of centralized authority. Officials and temple administrators could rely on tangible evidence to justify decisions, coordinate labor, and maintain oversight of increasingly complex urban systems. Written communication effectively bridged spatial and temporal constraints, allowing centralized control over settlements that extended across the city and surrounding fields. Cuneiform's evolution further demonstrates how early writing was shaped by practical demands. Symbols were simplified from pictographs into wedge-shaped impressions, enabling faster, more standardized inscription on clay. This innovation allowed scribes to produce larger volumes of records efficiently, supporting the administrative needs of an expanding urban society. Over centuries, cuneiform would be adapted to record laws, literature, and scientific knowledge, but its origins remained firmly grounded in accounting, labor management, and the regulation of urban life. By the end of the Uruk period, writing had become an essential instrument of governance. It enabled the collection of taxes, the coordination of labor for public projects, and the facilitation of trade over long distances. Written records strengthened centralized authority by creating transparency, standardization, and accountability. Far from a purely intellectual or literary invention, writing emerged as a practical tool intimately connected to the economic and social realities of early cities, laying the foundation for the administrative, legal, and cultural achievements of Sumerian civilization. By the late Uruk period, southern Mesopotamian cities had become hubs of extensive economic networks. The alluvial plain, while fertile, lacked critical raw materials such as timber, stone, metals, and certain high-quality clays. This scarcity created strong incentives for long-distance exchange, connecting Sumerian cities to upland regions in Anatolia, the Zagros Mountains, and the Persian Gulf. Archaeological evidence, including imported stone tools, timber fragments, and exotic shells, demonstrates that Mesopotamian communities actively engaged in complex trade networks that spanned hundreds of kilometers, creating interdependent economic relationships well before the rise of formal states. Material evidence reveals the routes and mechanisms of trade. Timber for construction and fuel was transported from forested highlands in the Zagros, while obsidian and other volcanic stones reached Mesopotamia from Anatolia. Copper, silver, and semi-precious stones arrived from distant sources, supporting both practical and luxury production. Shells and other marine products were imported from the Persian Gulf, likely via river and overland channels. These flows required careful planning, coordination, and knowledge of seasonal and geographic conditions, reflecting an early logistical sophistication. Markets, both formal and informal, emerged as focal points where local products could be exchanged for these scarce materials. Trade had profound effects on urban economies. The circulation of raw materials enabled specialized craft production, including ceramics, metalwork, and ornamentation. Artisans could concentrate on specific skills rather than subsistence, improving efficiency and quality. Standardized measures and weights, attested on early cuneiform tablets, facilitated fair exchange and reduced disputes. The regularity of these systems demonstrates that Sumerian cities were not only consuming imported goods, but actively organizing their movement and accounting, creating a proto-globalized economic framework. Interdependence created by resource scarcity also shaped social and political dynamics. Communities relied on one another for critical materials, which encouraged alliances, shared norms, and negotiation. At the same time, the necessity of securing trade routes and resources may have generated competition and conflict. Control over key nodes in the exchange network, such as river access points or productive craft centers, could confer significant economic and political advantage. This dynamic underscores how resource distribution influenced both cooperation and rivalry among early Mesopotamian settlements. The integration of long-distance trade into local economies reinforced urban growth. Surpluses could be exchanged for raw materials not available locally, enabling the production of luxury goods, monumental architecture, and administrative tools. Trade supported elite households, temples, and emerging leadership structures by providing access to items that symbolized status and authority. Imported materials were not merely functional. They carried social and cultural significance, helping to consolidate the identities and hierarchies emerging in cities like Uruk. An important insight from this period is that scarcity and specialization were mutually reinforcing. The inability to source all necessary resources locally encouraged trade, while trade enabled craft specialization and surplus accumulation. This cycle accelerated economic complexity and fostered interdependence, creating a networked system of production and exchange unprecedented in prehistory. Early Mesopotamian cities were therefore not isolated entities but active participants in a regional economy, relying on both human coordination and environmental knowledge to function effectively. Trade networks also enhanced the spread of ideas and cultural practices. Imported objects introduced new technologies, artistic styles, and administrative techniques. The movement of goods facilitated communication and exchange of knowledge across regions, reinforcing cultural cohesion alongside economic integration. This process set the stage for innovations in writing, standardization, and governance, demonstrating the interrelationship between economy and institutional development. By the end of the Uruk period, southern Mesopotamian cities had developed dense, interconnected economic networks linking urban centers to distant regions. Resource scarcity drove the creation of exchange systems, interdependent production, and logistical expertise, while simultaneously shaping social hierarchies and political organization. These networks strengthened the material foundation of early cities and created conditions that intensified competition over resources, labor, and strategic locations. Economic growth, facilitated by trade and specialization, thus laid the groundwork for increasing political complexity and the eventual emergence of formal state structures in Sumer. By the late 4th millennium BCE, southern Mesopotamia had evolved from a landscape of dispersed villages and proto-urban centers into a patchwork of densely populated settlements, each exercising increasing autonomy. This process led to the formation of the first city-states, including prominent centers such as Uar, Lagash, Kish, and Uruk. Each city-state functioned as an independent political and economic unit, controlling its immediate hinterland and maintaining authority through both administrative and religious institutions. Unlike later empires, These early Sumerian cities did not coalesce under a single ruler. Instead, sovereignty remained localized, reflecting the practical and cultural realities of the alluvial plain. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that city-states were defined by both geography and patronage. Rivers, canals, and natural levees created identifiable territorial boundaries, which communities defended and administered. Each city recognized a particular patron deity, whose temple acted as the spiritual and economic center. For example, Nana was venerated at Uar, while Ningirsu was associated with Lagash. Temples not only coordinated religious activities but also managed surplus, oversaw labor, and organized irrigation maintenance, reinforcing the city's autonomy and providing a shared ideological framework for governance. Political authority in these city-states was initially linked to religious institutions, but the growing complexity of urban life required more formal leadership. The earliest rulers, often titled Ensi or Lugal, combined administrative and military responsibilities. Inscriptions and administrative tablets indicate that these leaders oversaw the collection of tribute, organized workforce mobilization for public projects, and represented the city in external affairs. Their authority was legitimized both by religious association and practical competence, blending spiritual sanction with administrative necessity. Unlike later monarchies, leadership could be situational or contested, reflecting a balance between institutional oversight and social negotiation. Economic factors reinforced the independence of city-states. Each urban center controlled its surrounding agricultural land, irrigation systems, and craft production, creating a localized base of resources. Surplus management through temple and palace institutions enabled rulers to maintain social order and support specialized labor, from scribes and artisans to soldiers. This autonomy limited the feasibility of a single centralized authority, as each city had the resources and infrastructure to function independently while interacting with neighboring centers through trade, diplomacy, or conflict. Intercity relationships were complex and dynamic. While trade networks linked Sumerian cities, competition over fertile land, water rights, and access to trade routes often generated conflict. Textual records from later periods reference skirmishes, boundary disputes, and military campaigns between city-states, reflecting patterns established during their formative stages. These interactions demonstrate that fragmentation was both a response to environmental conditions and a reflection of social and economic realities, where multiple centers of authority could coexist without being subsumed under a single polity. One important insight is that political decentralization allowed for experimentation in governance. Each city-state could develop administrative structures, legal codes, and leadership models suited to its own needs. The flexibility of localized authority fostered innovation in law, record-keeping, and public works, setting precedents that would influence later Sumerian political institutions. Autonomy also encouraged a degree of accountability, as rulers were directly responsible to their citizenry, temple officials, and patron deity, maintaining legitimacy through tangible performance. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, Sumerian city-states had become fully established, each with distinct identity, governance, and economic infrastructure. While shared cultural practices, religious beliefs, and trade networks linked them, the absence of overarching political unification was deliberate and functional. The environmental challenges of the alluvial plain, coupled with the logistical demands of urban management, made localized governance more practical than centralized control. This fragmentation created a competitive landscape in which cities developed formal leadership structures to assert authority, coordinate resources, and maintain social cohesion, laying the foundation for more complex political evolution in the centuries that followed. In early Sumerian city-states, the concept of kingship was deeply intertwined with religion, reflecting a worldview in which divine favor legitimized human authority. Rulers, often titled Lugal or Ensi, claimed to govern not solely through personal skill or force, but as agents of their city's patron deity. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions, votive offerings, and temple reliefs, illustrates how kings invoked the protection and sanction of gods to justify their position. This fusion of spiritual and political authority was central to maintaining social cohesion and organizing increasingly complex urban populations. Temple-centered economies reinforced the divine basis of rulership. Kings were often responsible for overseeing the construction, maintenance, and offerings of temples dedicated to their city's patron god. By managing these sacred spaces, they demonstrated piety while simultaneously controlling resources, labor, and surplus stored within temple complexes. Inscriptions frequently describe rulers as chosen by deities, with phrases such as appointed by the god Ningirsu or favored by Nana, emphasizing their divinely sanctioned mandate. This rhetoric reinforced obedience, framing civic duties and labor contributions as participation in a divinely ordained order. Military and political authority were similarly legitimized through religious symbolism. Leaders often led campaigns in the name of their deity, presenting victories as evidence of divine favor. Victory stelae, such as those of Ionatum of Lagash, depict rulers carrying out campaigns with the explicit endorsement of gods, highlighting a moral and cosmic justification for conquest and governance. By linking success in warfare to divine approval, kings reinforced their role as intermediaries between the human and supernatural realms, securing loyalty through both fear and reverence. The integration of divine legitimacy also shaped administrative practices. Scribes and officials, operating within temple and palace systems, recorded transactions, rations, and labor assignments on clay tablets. Many of these records included invocations or dedications to gods, framing bureaucratic tasks as sacred duties. This approach not only structured civic activity, but also reinforced the ideological connection between rulership and religious authority. Citizens, workers, and officials alike were thus constantly reminded that their obligations were part of a larger cosmic and social order sanctioned by the divine. An important insight from this period is that divine legitimization was both pragmatic and symbolic. While kings used religion to justify authority, this system also enabled them to mobilize labor, resources, and military forces effectively. By presenting governance as a sacred responsibility rather than mere coercion, rulers encouraged voluntary compliance and created shared social norms that transcended individual households. Religious ideology therefore functioned as a practical tool for administration and state-building, not simply as spiritual expression. The symbolic power of kingship extended to ceremonial life. Rulers presided over festivals, ritual offerings, and seasonal observances that reinforced communal identity and reaffirmed their divine mandate. These public rituals served as both religious observance and political demonstration, making authority visible to the population and integrating spiritual devotion with civic participation. Such practices strengthened the legitimacy of governance while providing a framework for collective cultural and social experience. By establishing the king as a divinely endorsed intermediary, early Sumerian city-states created a model in which political power was inseparable from religious legitimacy. This framework justified centralized decision-making, coordinated labor, and military action while fostering loyalty and social cohesion. The combination of spiritual sanction and administrative competence laid the ideological foundation for the codification of rules and laws, which would become essential for managing increasingly complex urban societies. In this way, kingship and divine legitimacy formed the conceptual backbone of Sumerian governance, linking cosmic order with civic organization and paving the way for structured legal systems. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, the growing complexity of Sumerian city-states necessitated formal mechanisms to regulate social behavior, resolve disputes, and maintain order. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that rulers began codifying laws to address issues arising from dense urban populations, resource management, and social differentiation. Among the earliest known legal codes is that attributed to Ur-Nammu of Ur, dating to around 2100 to 2050 BCE. These laws represent a deliberate effort to define acceptable conduct, prescribe penalties for transgressions, and provide a framework for justice that was accessible and consistent across the city-state. The Ur-Nammu Code, preserved on clay tablets, emphasizes protection of property, family relations, and contractual obligations. Specific regulations addressed theft, damage to property, and violations of labor agreements, reflecting practical concerns arising from urban life. For example, provisions for compensation in cases of injury or property damage indicate an understanding of reciprocity and social responsibility. The codification of these rules reduced reliance on arbitrary judgment, creating predictability in legal outcomes and reinforcing social cohesion. Family and personal status were also central to early law. Marriage contracts, inheritance rules, and obligations of dependents were regulated to prevent disputes and ensure continuity of household structures. Textual evidence reveals penalties for actions such as adultery, neglect of dependents, or refusal to fulfill contractual duties. By clearly defining responsibilities and consequences, the law sought to stabilize both domestic life and broader community interactions. These regulations reflect an early recognition that social order depends not only on authority, but also on shared norms codified for reference. Economic transactions were another major focus of early law. Contracts for labor, trade, and resource use were regulated to ensure fairness and accountability. Clay tablets recording agreements often accompanied the legal framework, demonstrating that documentation and codification functioned together to manage increasingly complex urban economies. Standardized measures and clear definitions of obligations facilitated trust in both local and long-distance exchange, reducing conflict and enhancing economic efficiency. Enforcement of the law combined both royal authority and communal oversight. While the king or ensi was responsible for ensuring that justice was administered, temples and local officials played practical roles in adjudication and record-keeping. Public acknowledgement of the laws, coupled with tangible penalties, reinforced the perception of fairness and divine sanction. The integration of religious legitimacy with legal authority strengthened compliance, as citizens understood that adherence to the law was both a civic and moral duty. An important insight from this period is that early laws were not merely punitive. They functioned as instruments of social engineering. By regulating relationships between individuals, households, and institutions, these codes sought to prevent conflict, distribute resources fairly, and protect vulnerable members of society. They reflect a proactive approach to governance, where the state anticipated potential problems and created structured solutions rather than relying solely on reactive measures. The codification of rules also facilitated administrative efficiency. By providing clear guidelines for behavior, the law reduced ambiguity in disputes and streamlined decision-making for officials. This system allowed urban authorities to manage larger populations effectively, coordinating labor, trade, and religious activities with greater predictability. Legal frameworks thus reinforced the stability necessary for continued urban growth and cultural development. By establishing consistent and enforceable standards of conduct, early Sumerian laws contributed directly to the functioning of complex city-states. They addressed practical challenges arising from population density, economic interdependence, and social differentiation, creating mechanisms to maintain order and fairness. Stable governance grounded in codified law provided the conditions for cultural flourishing, enabling innovations in writing, art, architecture, and religious practice to emerge within a secure and organized society. In early Sumerian civilization, religion permeated nearly every aspect of daily life, and the pantheon of gods reflected both the natural environment and the social organization of the city-states. Each major city maintained its own patron deity, creating a framework in which divine forces were intimately tied to local identity, political authority, and communal well-being. Archaeological evidence from temple sites, inscriptions, and votive offerings provides insight into the roles and relationships of gods such as Un, Enlil, Inanna, and Enki, revealing a complex system in which divine authority mirrored human governance. En, often considered the sky god, held a position of supreme authority in the Sumerian pantheon, representing the overarching cosmic order. While En rarely appears directly in daily cult practices, his presence legitimized the hierarchy of lesser deities and maintained the conceptual framework of divine rule. Enlil, associated with air, storms, and decrees, acted as the enforcer of cosmic and societal order, with temples in Nippur serving as central hubs for religious and political legitimacy. Kings and temple officials claimed authority as intermediaries of Enlil's will, reinforcing the connection between divine sanction and governance. Control over the worship of Enlil was thus a source of political as well as spiritual power, illustrating the integration of religion and administration. Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and war, demonstrates the multifunctional nature of Sumerian deities. Her worship was particularly prominent in Uruk, where she oversaw both agricultural fertility and civic protection. Temples dedicated to Inanna served not only as ritual centers, but also as administrative nodes, coordinating offerings and labor while supporting trade and craft production. Enki, god of water, wisdom, and creation, was associated with the city of Eridu and held particular importance for knowledge, innovation, and the management of irrigation. Myths and inscriptions link Enki to problem-solving and the distribution of divine gifts, reflecting the societal value placed on practical intelligence and resource management. Patronage of gods by specific cities helped define urban identity and political cohesion. Citizens understood their city's deity as both protector and overseer, creating a sense of communal belonging rooted in shared ritual and mythology. Festivals, offerings, and temple-centered activities reinforced these connections, tying spiritual practice to agricultural cycles, trade, and civic events. Religious observance thus served as a mechanism for social cohesion, linking individual and collective responsibilities to divine oversight. The pantheon was not static, it reflected historical developments and political realities. Deities' prominence could rise or fall depending on the fortunes of their associated cities or the influence of particular dynasties. Inscriptions record shifts in temple building, offerings, and ritual emphasis corresponding to changing political hierarchies. This dynamic interplay demonstrates that Sumerian religion was both culturally adaptive and deeply intertwined with governance, providing legitimacy and social structure while accommodating regional variation. An important insight from this period is that religion functioned as a comprehensive organizational tool. The integration of deities into civic life, economic activity, and political authority facilitated both cooperation and compliance. By embodying cosmic principles in local institutions, Sumerian gods provided models for human behavior, regulation, and collective responsibility. The pantheon structure mirrored urban hierarchy, linking sacred and secular spheres in a mutually reinforcing system. The Sumerian pantheon also inspired artistic and literary expression. Temples were decorated with reliefs, votive statues, and inscriptions illustrating divine narratives, while myths recorded on clay tablets conveyed lessons about morality, leadership, and cosmology. These cultural products reflect the ways in which religious belief shaped social norms, ethical expectations, and aesthetic standards, embedding spirituality deeply within civic identity. By assigning gods to specific cities and functions, Sumerians created a framework in which religion guided social, political, and economic activity. Understanding the pantheon is therefore essential for comprehending broader aspects of Sumerian culture. Divine authority reinforced human governance, inspired artistic and literary achievements, and structured communal life, establishing a coherent ideological foundation that shaped cultural expression across the region. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, literacy and literary culture had become integral components of Sumerian civilization, largely centered around temple-based scribal schools known as adaba, or houses of tablets. These institutions trained young scribes in cuneiform writing, arithmetic, and administrative record-keeping, equipping them to manage the growing complexity of urban economies, religious obligations, and governmental bureaucracy. While practical skills dominated the curriculum, scribes also preserved and transmitted myths, hymns, and epic narratives, ensuring that cultural knowledge and shared identity endured across generations despite the fragility of clay tablets and the perishable nature of other materials. Literary production in Sumer was both a religious and civic enterprise. Hymns dedicated to deities such as Inanna or Enlil were composed to accompany ritual ceremonies and reinforce the social hierarchy encoded in temple life. Myths and stories, including creation narratives, flood accounts, and tales of divine human interaction, serve to explain the world, natural phenomena, and human behavior within a framework sanctioned by divine authority. By codifying these narratives in writing, Sumerians preserved communal memory, providing continuity for social norms, ethical expectations, and political legitimacy. Among the most influential works recorded by scribes was the Epic of Gilgamesh, which, while finalized in later periods, has roots in Sumerian oral tradition and early written accounts. The epic portrays the adventures of Gilgamesh, a king of Uruk, and explores themes of mortality, friendship, and leadership. In addition to its literary value, the narrative reinforces civic ideals and moral principles, linking the deeds of rulers and citizens to divine oversight and societal responsibility. Through such texts, literature functioned as both education and cultural reinforcement, instructing readers on the interplay between human effort, communal obligation, and the cosmic order. Scribal schools themselves were centers of socialization and elite formation. Students learned not only technical skills, but also the ethical and cultural norms that defined Sumerian society. Apprenticeship involved memorization, copying tablets, and practical exercises in accounting and correspondence. Mastery of cuneiform provided access to administrative positions, temple duties, and participation in governance, creating a literate class capable of sustaining bureaucratic and cultural continuity. This system reinforced social stratification while simultaneously promoting cohesion through shared education and ritual knowledge. An important insight is that literary preservation addressed both practical and existential needs. In a world of fragile materials, political instability, and environmental uncertainty, writing offered a durable means of safeguarding economic records, legal codes, and cultural narratives. The act of inscribing stories and hymns transformed ephemeral oral traditions into enduring repositories of collective memory, linking successive generations to the foundations of Sumerian identity. Written literature thus functioned as a stabilizing force, transmitting both administrative competence and cultural values. Literary activity also contributed to innovation in language, symbolism, and intellectual thought. The abstraction required by cuneiform allowed scribes to represent complex ideas, express philosophical reflections, and codify systematic knowledge, from astronomical observations to mathematical calculations. The interplay between creative expression and practical administration illustrates how Sumerians integrated culture with the mechanisms of urban governance, embedding intellectual achievement within everyday societal functioning. By preserving myths, hymns, and epics through formal education and scribal practice, Sumerians reinforced cultural identity, social norms, and communal cohesion. Literature served multiple functions as pedagogy, moral guidance, and a vehicle for historical memory. It ensured that urban populations, temple officials, and future leaders could internalize the values, knowledge, and beliefs that underpinned their civilization. Through this codification of cultural heritage, Sumerians created a durable framework that strengthened collective identity, prepared citizens for civic participation, and solidified the ideological foundation necessary for the cohesion and resilience of complex city-states. Sumerian civilization was remarkable not only for its urban and cultural achievements, but also for its early contributions to scientific thought and practical technology. Evidence from clay tablets, inscriptions, and artifacts demonstrates that Sumerians developed sophisticated systems of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering, integrating these innovations into daily life and administrative practice. Their work laid conceptual foundations that influenced subsequent Mesopotamian cultures and, indirectly, the broader development of human knowledge. Mathematics in Sumer emerged primarily to meet the practical demands of urban administration, trade, and agriculture. Sumerians employed a sexagesimal, or base, 60, number system, which allowed for calculations involving large quantities, time, and geometric measurements. Clay tablets reveal arithmetic exercises, accounting records, and computations related to area and volume, particularly for construction and irrigation projects. This numerical system provided a flexible and efficient means of quantifying resources, enabling precise allocation of grain, labor, and materials. The sexagesimal system also influenced the measurement of time, dividing hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees, demonstrating a conceptual legacy that persists in modern mathematics and astronomy. Astronomy was closely linked to both ritual and practical needs. Sumerian priests observed celestial bodies to predict seasonal changes, determine planting and harvesting cycles, and schedule religious festivals. Records of lunar phases, star positions, and planetary movements illustrate an empirical approach to observing and recording natural phenomena. While often framed in a theological context, these observations required careful measurement and pattern recognition, forming the basis of predictive calendars and contributing to early chronometry. The integration of astronomy with urban planning and ritual life exemplifies how scientific observation was interwoven with social and religious structures. Medical knowledge in Sumer was similarly practical, combining empirical treatment with ritual intervention. Clay tablets contain lists of symptoms, prescriptions, and procedures for illnesses, injuries, and digestive or respiratory conditions. Physicians, often temple-associated, used a combination of plant-based remedies, poultices, and surgical techniques. While some treatments were framed as appeasing gods or spirits, others reflect observation-based practices, including hygiene, diet, and physical manipulation. This dual approach demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between the natural and spiritual dimensions of health. Everyday technology further illustrates Sumerian ingenuity. Innovations included wheeled vehicles, the potter's wheel, bronze tools, irrigation systems, and sophisticated architectural techniques. Canals, levees, and reservoirs required engineering knowledge to manage water flow and soil salinity, while urban construction employed standardized mud bricks and modular layouts for efficiency. These technologies improved agricultural productivity, enabled the creation of larger settlements, and facilitated long-distance trade. The combination of engineering, mathematics, and practical experimentation reflects a systematic approach to problem-solving rooted in observation and iterative refinement. An important insight is that Sumerian scientific activity was deeply integrated into societal needs. Knowledge was not pursued solely for abstraction, but to address tangible challenges, calculating rations, predicting floods, treating illness, and managing urban infrastructure. This practical orientation ensured that scientific advances directly contributed to economic stability, social organization, and cultural continuity. At the same time, the codification of information in clay tablets preserved discoveries across generations, creating a cumulative intellectual tradition. The interplay between science and daily life also reinforced social structures. Educated scribes, priest-scientists, and skilled artisans occupied critical roles, translating specialized knowledge into actionable solutions. Their expertise supported urban administration, temple activities, and craft production, embedding technical knowledge within the fabric of society. Scientific literacy thus became a marker of social status and a necessary component of governance and ritual management. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, Sumerian innovations in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and technology had transformed urban life, supporting population growth, economic complexity, and civic cohesion. These practical applications of knowledge allowed cities to thrive in a challenging environment while laying conceptual foundations for subsequent civilizations. Prosperity derived from these scientific and technological achievements, however, also heightened competition for resources and strategic advantage, setting the stage for conflicts between city-states and foreshadowing the political and military challenges of later Sumerian history. In early Sumer, the concentration of population, the reliance on irrigation, and the accumulation of surplus created both opportunity and tension among city-states. While trade and cultural exchange fostered interdependence, they also exposed cities to competition over limited fertile land, access to canals, and control of strategic resources. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that conflicts were frequent, with disputes often escalating into organized warfare. One of the most well-documented examples is the prolonged rivalry between Lagash and Umma over borderlands and irrigation rights, illustrating how environmental and economic pressures directly influenced political and military activity. Irrigation was central to both agriculture and power. In the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, fertile soil depended on carefully managed canals, levees, and water channels. Control over water not only determined agricultural output, but also underpinned the economic and social stability of city-states. Disputes arose when upstream and downstream communities competed for access, particularly during periods of drought or fluctuating river levels. Textual records from Lagash describe formal agreements regarding shared canals, as well as violations that led to military engagement. The management of irrigation thus transformed from a technical task into a potential source of interstate conflict, linking environmental necessity with political strategy. The Lagash-Umma Wars exemplify early Sumerian military organization. Inscriptions and victory stele recount campaigns, mobilization of troops, and the use of weapons such as slings, spears, and bows. City-states raised militias drawn from male citizens and laborers, often led by the Insi or Lugal, who combined religious legitimacy with martial authority. These conflicts were not merely opportunistic raids. They were structured, goal-oriented campaigns designed to secure land, resources, and political dominance. Administrative tablets reveal logistical preparation, including the allocation of rations, equipment, and transport, demonstrating that warfare required significant coordination and planning. Economic motivations were closely intertwined with military objectives. Fertile land, control of irrigation networks, and access to trade routes determined a city-state's capacity to support its population and elite institutions, including temples and palaces. Capturing or defending territory directly affected agricultural productivity and surplus management, making warfare a critical tool for securing long-term economic stability. This practical linkage between resources and military action underscores the interconnectedness of Sumerian urban, economic, and political life. Rivalries also stimulated technological and tactical innovation. Evidence suggests the early use of city walls, fortifications, and defensive ditches to protect settlements. Armies adapted strategies based on terrain, watercourses, and population density, while weapon production became increasingly specialized. The integration of engineering, logistics, and coordinated leadership illustrates how conflict prompted the refinement of administrative and technical capabilities, benefiting both military and civilian spheres. An important insight from these intercity conflicts is that they reinforced political hierarchies and leadership legitimacy. Successful military campaigns enhanced a ruler's prestige, demonstrating competence in both secular and divine roles. Victory stele and inscriptions linked triumphs to the favor of patron deities, strengthening claims to authority and reinforcing social cohesion within the victorious city-state. Conversely, defeats could undermine legitimacy, illustrating the high stakes of competition in the fragmented political landscape of early Sumer. Despite the destructive potential of warfare, these conflicts were often cyclical and regulated. Treaties, boundary markers, and formalized agreements suggest that city-states recognize the need for negotiated settlements to prevent continual disruption. These mechanisms indicate a sophisticated understanding of diplomacy, law, and mutual dependence, even amid intense rivalry. Military engagement, therefore, coexisted with economic collaboration and cultural exchange, reflecting a balance of competition and cooperation in early Sumerian society. By the end of this period, intercity rivalries had become an integral aspect of Sumerian civilization. Disputes over land, water, and resources prompted organized warfare, refined military organization, and reinforced the authority of rulers. These conflicts placed significant strain on city resources, requiring careful management of labor, surplus, and infrastructure. At the same time, they highlighted the interdependence of environmental, economic, and political factors, demonstrating that the pressures of urbanization and prosperity inherently carried the seeds of competition and conflict. This tension between growth and rivalry set the stage for further challenges in governance, law, and interstate relations across the Sumerian landscape. As Sumerian city-states matured, the frequency and scale of conflicts necessitated a systematic approach to defense and warfare. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that cities began constructing substantial fortifications, including walls, gates, and defensive ditches, to protect against both rival city-states and opportunistic raiders. These structures required coordinated labor, engineering knowledge, and centralized oversight, reflecting the increasing institutionalization of military activity. The emergence of organized armies marked a shift from ad hoc militias to permanent, structured forces capable of defending urban populations and projecting power over surrounding territories. Fortifications were a critical component of urban strategy. Excavations at sites such as Uruk, Lagash, and Kish reveal multi-layered mud brick walls, sometimes accompanied by towers and gate complexes. These defensive works were designed not only to deter attack, but also to control access to key urban areas, regulate trade, and assert the city's presence in the landscape. The scale and complexity of these constructions indicate that planning and resource mobilization were integral to military preparedness, linking engineering, administration, and social organization in ways that reinforced urban governance. Weapons and military technology evolved alongside defensive structures. Sumerian armies employed spears, daggers, bows, and slings, while shields and helmets provided protection in battle. Evidence from depictions on cylinder seals, reliefs, and cuneiform accounts suggests that units were organized into coordinated groups with specialized roles, including infantry, archers, and possibly chariot crews in later periods. Production of weapons required skilled artisans and access to raw materials, demonstrating an intersection of craft specialization and military logistics that further institutionalized warfare within urban economies. Armies were closely tied to civic and religious structures. Leaders, often the Ensi or Lugal, commanded troops while invoking divine sanction, reinforcing both political authority and social cohesion. Temple institutions frequently contributed to the organization and provisioning of military forces, coordinating labor, supplying food and equipment, and maintaining communication through written records. This integration of religious, administrative, and military functions illustrates how warfare became a structured, predictable, and socially sanctioned component of city-state life, rather than an irregular or spontaneous activity. An important insight from this period is that militarization affected multiple aspects of society. Fortifications, weapons production, and organized armies required substantial human and material investment, influencing labor allocation, economic planning, and technological innovation. Resources devoted to defense competed with those for agriculture, trade, and monumental construction, illustrating the balancing act inherent in sustaining urban society. At the same time, the presence of organized military forces contributed to deterrence, territorial security, and the enforcement of political authority, reinforcing the power of city rulers. The institutionalization of war also shaped political hierarchies. Leaders who could successfully mobilize, equip, and command troops enhanced their legitimacy, demonstrating competence in both secular and divine domains. Military success reinforced social stratification, with elite warriors and commanders occupying privileged positions while ordinary citizens contributed through conscription or logistical support. This relationship between warfare, social hierarchy, and governance underscores the interdependence of military and civic structures in early Sumerian cities. By the end of this phase, sustained militarization had become a defining feature of Sumerian urban life. Fortifications protected cities, weapons and tactical organization enhanced defensive and offensive capabilities, and formalized armies institutionalized conflict within societal structures. While these measures provided security and reinforced authority, they also placed heavy demands on labor, resources, and administration, gradually exposing the limits of political stability. The pressures of ongoing militarization, combined with competition over land, water, and trade, set the stage for internal stress, leadership challenges, and the eventual cycles of decline and reform that characterized the later development of Sumerian civilization. Sumerian city-states faced persistent external pressures from neighboring populations, including Semitic-speaking groups from the north and west, as well as mountain communities from the Zagros foothills. These interactions were multifaceted, ranging from sporadic raids and military incursions to trade, migration, and cultural exchange. Archaeological and textual evidence, such as battle records, settlement patterns, and imported material culture, reveals that Sumerians had to negotiate both the opportunities and threats posed by these outsiders, shaping military strategy, diplomacy, and urban development. The Semitic-speaking groups, who later became known as Akkadians, gradually moved into Mesopotamia from the northwest. Early records indicate intermittent conflict, including skirmishes over fertile land and control of trade routes. At the same time, these groups introduced new linguistic, cultural, and technological elements that influenced Sumerian society. Material evidence, such as pottery styles, inscriptions, and settlement remains, demonstrates that interaction was not purely hostile. Cultural integration and intermarriage facilitated the diffusion of ideas and practices. The dual role of these outsiders as both challengers and collaborators illustrates the complex dynamics of early Mesopotamian frontiers. Mountain peoples from the Zagros foothills also posed strategic and economic pressures. Their mobility and familiarity with highland terrain allowed them to raid settlements, control key passes, and extract tribute. Sumerian city-states responded by reinforcing fortifications, organizing military patrols, and developing logistical strategies to secure agricultural hinterlands. At the same time, the highlands provided valuable resources, including timber, metals, and stone, which required negotiation and occasional alliance. This interplay between conflict and resource dependency reflects the nuanced relationships between urban centers and surrounding regions. External pressures accelerated the professionalization of military and administrative systems. Facing both persistent threats and the need to coordinate defense over wider territories, city-states formalized armies, established command structures, and implemented logistical planning. Temple and palace institutions contributed to provisioning and strategic oversight, integrating religious, economic, and military authority. In this way, external challenges drove innovations that strengthened urban resilience while reinforcing the authority of rulers and officials. An important insight is that outsiders were not merely invaders, they were agents of transformation. Their presence stimulated trade, technology transfer, and cultural exchange, even as they challenged territorial integrity. Encounters with Semitic groups and highland populations introduced new ideas, crafts, and organizational strategies that Sumerians adapted to their own social and political systems. This dynamic interplay between threat and opportunity highlights the role of migration and cross-cultural contact in shaping early civilizations. The dual pressures of internal competition and external threat created a feedback loop influencing governance and urban planning. Defensive infrastructure, military mobilization, and diplomatic negotiation were increasingly embedded in civic administration. Leaders who could balance security needs with economic and cultural exchange enhanced their legitimacy and ensured the stability of their city-state. Conversely, failure to manage external pressures could result in resource loss, population displacement, or political upheaval. By the end of this period, Sumerian city-states had developed sophisticated responses to external pressures, combining military preparedness, diplomacy, and adaptive governance. Interaction with Semitic neighbors and mountain communities accelerated the transformation of urban society, driving both technological innovation and social complexity. These external dynamics complemented internal competition, demonstrating that Sumer's development was shaped not only by its rivers and fields, but also by its position within a network of neighboring peoples whose influence was both challenging and integrative. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, southern Mesopotamia faced mounting environmental challenges that directly affected the sustainability of Sumerian urban life. Chief among these was salinization, the gradual accumulation of salts in irrigated soils. Archaeological surveys, sediment analysis, and paleo-environmental studies indicate that intensive irrigation, combined with poor drainage and high evaporation rates, progressively degraded fertile land. Fields that had once supported abundant cereal crops, such as barley and wheat, experienced reduced yields, threatening the food security that underpinned urban populations, temple economies, and administrative systems. Irrigation, while essential to Sumerian agriculture, created long-term ecological risks. Canals diverted river water to fields, but in the arid climate of the alluvial plain, evaporation left salts concentrated in the topsoil. Over successive generations, repeated flooding and irrigation cycles exacerbated this process. Excavations at sites such as Ur and Lagash reveal layers of salt-encrusted soil interspersed with abandoned field boundaries, demonstrating a gradual but persistent decline in arable land. Scholars argue that this environmental stress forced farmers to expand cultivation into marginal areas, increasing labor demands and reducing overall efficiency. Salinization had cascading economic and social consequences. Reduced crop yields diminished surplus production, weakening the ability of temples and palaces to store and redistribute food. This, in turn, strained the legitimacy of rulers who relied on surplus management to maintain social order and support labor mobilization for construction, trade, and military projects. As productivity declined, competition for remaining fertile land intensified, exacerbating inter-city rivalries and internal tensions. Textual records suggest that some cities experienced famine and depopulation, highlighting the link between environmental degradation and social instability. The effects of salinization were compounded by broader climatic fluctuations. Evidence from pollen cores and sediment studies suggests periods of decreased river flow and irregular flooding, which disrupted irrigation schedules and contributed to waterlogging in some areas while leaving others dry. These variations further undermined agricultural reliability, forcing city-states to adapt through more intensive labor, technological adjustments, and administrative oversight. Nevertheless, the cumulative impact of soil degradation exceeded the capacity of existing management strategies, creating persistent ecological stress. An important insight is that Sumerian practices, though innovative, inadvertently contributed to long-term vulnerability. The very irrigation systems that enabled urban growth and economic prosperity also generated environmental challenges that could not be easily reversed. This dynamic illustrates the interplay between human engineering and ecological limits, emphasizing that civilization building can carry unintended consequences when sustainability is not fully integrated into long-term planning. Environmental stress also influenced demographic and settlement patterns. Declining soil fertility prompted the abandonment of peripheral fields and even entire settlements, leading to urban contraction in some regions. Migration toward better-watered or less salinized areas altered the distribution of population, affecting labor availability, trade networks, and political control. These shifts reveal how ecological factors directly shaped social organization, economic networks, and political stability in Sumerian city-states. By the end of this period, environmental pressures had weakened the economic foundation of Sumerian cities. Agricultural decline reduced surplus, undermined political authority, and heightened competition both within and between city-states. The persistent salinization of soils demonstrates that ecological management was a critical determinant of urban resilience. These challenges set the stage for transformations in governance, social structure, and intercity relations, as communities struggled to adapt to a changing environment, illustrating how natural and human factors combined to shape the trajectory of Sumerian civilization. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, environmental pressures, economic strain, and ongoing inter-city rivalries contributed to a pronounced political fragmentation among Sumerian city-states. Once autonomous centers such as Ur, Lagash, and Uruk experienced declining central authority as rulers struggled to maintain surplus distribution, manage labor, and defend territory. Textual records and administrative tablets indicate frequent changes in leadership, contested successions, and periods in which cities temporarily fell under the control of neighboring powers, reflecting a cyclical instability that eroded long-standing civic cohesion. Internal dissent compounded fragmentation. Declining agricultural yields, exacerbated by salinization and irregular irrigation, placed stress on urban populations. Citizens increasingly challenged ruling elites over taxation, labor obligations, and access to resources. In some cases, temple and palace officials assumed de facto authority, creating competing centers of power within the same city. Archaeological evidence of abandoned administrative buildings and modifications to fortifications suggests that urban governance was in flux, with competing factions vying for control and undermining centralized authority. Intercity competition intensified the fragmentation. With weakened central governance, cities were less capable of forming alliances or enforcing territorial boundaries, making them vulnerable to external pressures. Military records and stele indicate frequent skirmishes over land, water, and trade routes, but the capacity for coordinated defense was uneven. Smaller or economically weakened city-states often negotiated temporary truces or accepted subordination to stronger neighbors, further eroding political independence and autonomy. This pattern demonstrates that fragmentation was not merely a result of internal mismanagement, but also a product of systemic pressures across the Sumerian landscape. Leadership instability also disrupted long-term planning. Urban projects such as canal maintenance, temple construction, and fortification repair required consistent administrative oversight, yet repeated changes in rulers interrupted these activities. Delays in irrigation upkeep, for example, exacerbated soil salinization and reduced agricultural output, creating a feedback loop in which political weakness and environmental stress reinforced one another. In this context, fragmentation became both a symptom and a cause of declining resilience within city-states. An important insight is that Sumer's political fragmentation illustrates the limitations of decentralized urban systems in the face of ecological and economic pressures. Unlike later centralized empires, the city-state model relied heavily on localized governance, which provided flexibility during growth but created vulnerability under stress. Autonomy allowed individual cities to innovate and experiment, but it also made collective coordination difficult, preventing unified responses to shared challenges. This structural weakness contributed to cycles of conquest, alliance, and rebellion that characterized the later Sumerian period. The erosion of centralized authority also had social implications. As ruling elites lost control, temple institutions and guilds assumed greater influence over economic and religious life. Ordinary citizens gained both opportunities and burdens, negotiating labor obligations and resource access with multiple competing authorities. Fragmentation therefore reshaped not only political hierarchies but also patterns of social organization and community cohesion, reflecting the interconnectedness of governance, economy, and daily life. By the end of this phase, Sumerian city-states were politically fragmented, with diminished autonomy, contested leadership, and uneven capacity for collective action. This instability left the region vulnerable to external incursions and facilitated the rise of more centralized powers, setting the stage for conquest and eventual incorporation into larger empires. Political fragmentation, coupled with environmental and economic stress, illustrates how multiple factors converged to transform Sumerian society, highlighting the complex interplay between internal governance, resource management, and external pressures. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, the weakened and fragmented city-states of Sumer were vulnerable to the ambitions of emerging northern powers. Among these, the kingdom of Akkad rose to prominence under Sargon of Akkad, whose conquests around 2334 BCE established one of the first territorial empires in recorded history. Sumerian texts and later inscriptions describe Sargon's campaigns as rapid and extensive, bringing Uruk, Lagash, and other major cities under centralized Akkadian authority. Rather than erasing Sumerian culture, Akkad integrated its cities, administration, and religious institutions, creating a hybrid system that combined northern political control with southern cultural traditions. Sargon's strategy blended military force with administrative assimilation. He deployed organized armies to subdue resistant city-states, while installing governors loyal to Akkad to oversee local governance. Administrative records reveal that scribes continued using Sumerian cuneiform alongside Akkadian language elements, ensuring continuity in record-keeping, taxation, and temple management. By preserving Sumerian bureaucratic and religious frameworks, Akkad leveraged existing urban infrastructure rather than dismantling it, facilitating the empire's efficiency and stability. This approach allowed Sumerian cultural and institutional innovations to persist within a new political context. The Akkadian integration of Sumer also extended to religious practice. Temples retained their central role in economic and ceremonial life, and the patron deities of individual cities continued to receive offerings. Sargon and his successors claimed divine favor from these gods, presenting themselves as legitimate rulers sanctioned by the same cosmic order that had supported previous Sumerian kings. Inscriptions often emphasize the continuity of religious observance, suggesting that Akkad's political dominance coexisted with respect for Southern spiritual traditions, reinforcing social cohesion during a period of transition. Economically, Akkad relied on the surplus, trade networks, and irrigation systems established by the Sumerians. Grain production, textile manufacturing, and craft specialization continued under centralized imperial oversight, with tribute flowing from conquered cities to support military and administrative centers. The empire's control of intercity trade routes expanded long-distance exchange, linking Mesopotamia more closely to Anatolia, the Iranian Plateau, and the Gulf. Sumerian innovations in accounting, measurement, and written documentation proved essential for managing this complex economic integration, demonstrating the enduring relevance of Southern urban practices. An important insight is that Akkad's conquest represents both disruption and continuity. While military campaigns imposed political subordination, the incorporation of Sumerian institutions, religious practices, and administrative techniques ensured that the cultural and technological achievements of southern Mesopotamia were not lost. In this sense, Akkad acted as both a conqueror and a successor, transforming Sumerian city-states into components of a larger imperial system while preserving key elements of their identity. By the end of Sargon's expansion, Sumerian civilization had effectively transitioned from independent city-states to integrated provinces within an imperial framework. Although political autonomy was diminished, the social, cultural, and technological foundations developed over millennia continued to shape governance, religion, literature, and urban life. This period demonstrates that even amid conquest and structural change, Sumer's innovations endured, influencing subsequent Mesopotamian empires and leaving a legacy that would resonate throughout the region for centuries. Following the conquest of southern Mesopotamia by Sargon of Akkad and the establishment of imperial rule, Sumerian culture did not disappear. Instead, it persisted through deliberate adaptation, integration, and institutional continuity. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that, despite the loss of political autonomy, Sumerian language, religious practice, and administrative traditions remained deeply embedded in everyday life. Akkadian rulers relied heavily on these established systems, recognizing their effectiveness in managing complex urban societies. The Sumerian language continued to be used extensively, particularly in religious, legal, and administrative contexts. While Akkadian gradually became the spoken language of imperial administration, Sumerian retained its prestige as a sacred and scholarly language. Temple inscriptions, hymns, and legal formulas were still composed in Sumerian, and scribal education preserved its grammar and vocabulary. Clay tablets from this period show bilingual practices, indicating that scribes were trained to operate fluently in both languages. This linguistic continuity ensured that Sumerian intellectual and cultural traditions remained accessible to subsequent generations. Religious continuity was equally significant. Temples dedicated to traditional Sumerian deities such as Enlil, Inanna, and Enki continued to function as centers of worship, economic activity, and social organization. Akkadian rulers adopted these gods into their own pantheon, presenting themselves as legitimate successors sanctioned by the same divine order. Ritual calendars, festivals, and offerings followed long-established Sumerian patterns, reinforcing a sense of stability amid political change. This continuity allowed local populations to maintain religious identity while accommodating new political authority. Administrative practices further illustrate cultural resilience. The Akkadian state preserved Sumerian systems of record-keeping, measurement, and labor organization. Scribes continued to use cuneiform conventions developed in earlier centuries, and temple and palace economies operated using familiar methods of surplus storage and redistribution. By maintaining these structures, Akkadian governance minimized disruption and ensured efficient control over agricultural production, trade, and taxation. Sumerian institutional knowledge thus remained essential to imperial administration. An important insight from this period is that cultural survival depended on utility as much as tradition. Sumerian practices endured not simply because they were revered, but because they were practical, adaptable, and deeply integrated into urban life. Akkadian rulers recognized that dismantling these systems would undermine economic productivity and social stability. Instead, they incorporated Sumerian elites, scribes, and priests into the imperial framework, allowing culture to persist through collaboration rather than resistance. Material culture also reflects continuity and adaptation. Artistic styles, architectural forms, and everyday technologies show gradual modification rather than abrupt replacement. While new imperial motifs appeared, especially in royal iconography, local workshops continued producing traditional ceramics, seals, and religious objects. This blending of styles illustrates how Sumerian cultural identity evolved within a broader imperial context, maintaining recognizable forms while absorbing external influences. By sustaining language, religion, and administrative knowledge under Akkadian rule, Sumerian civilization demonstrated a capacity for adaptation that extended its influence beyond political decline. Conquest transformed governance, but it did not erase cultural foundations developed over millennia. Instead, Sumer evolved, embedding its traditions within a new imperial order and ensuring that its intellectual, religious, and institutional legacy continued to shape Mesopotamian society long after independent city-states had vanished. Following the decline of Akkadian authority at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, southern Mesopotamia entered a period of political fragmentation that unexpectedly created conditions for a Sumerian resurgence. This revival is most clearly represented by the UR3 period, conventionally dated from approximately 2112 to 2004 BCE, when the city of Ur emerged as the dominant power under a sequence of rulers beginning with Ur-Nammu. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that this was not a return to earlier city-state autonomy, but a consciously centralized and highly regulated system that drew heavily on older Sumerian traditions. Ur-Nammu established control over much of southern Mesopotamia after the collapse of Akkadian rule and the expulsion of the Gutian groups who had destabilized the region. He presented himself not as an innovator, but as a restorer of order, rebuilding temples, standardizing administration, and reasserting the authority of long-standing religious institutions. His reign marked the beginning of what historians describe as the Neo-Sumerian state, a polity that combined Sumerian cultural identity with unprecedented bureaucratic organization. Central to this revival was administrative reform. The UR3 state developed one of the most detailed and extensive record-keeping systems in ancient history. Tens of thousands of clay tablets document taxation, labor assignments, agricultural output, and state-controlled redistribution. These records reveal a highly managed economy in which land, herds, and labor were largely overseen by the palace and temple institutions. Provinces were governed by appointed officials who reported directly to the central authority at Ur, reducing the independence of local elites that had characterized earlier periods. An important factual insight from this era is the scale of bureaucratic control achieved without modern technology. Officials tracked workforce obligations, including corvée labor, with remarkable precision, assigning individuals to agricultural, construction, or craft tasks based on seasonal needs. This level of organization allowed the state to mobilize large labor forces for irrigation maintenance, temple construction, and food production, temporarily reversing patterns of economic decline that had emerged in the late Akkadian period. Legal and ideological reforms reinforced this centralized system. Ur-Nimmu is associated with one of the earliest known law codes, predating the more famous Code of Hammurabi by several centuries. These laws emphasized standardized penalties and state responsibility for justice, reflecting an effort to impose uniform legal norms across the territory. The king's authority was presented as divinely sanctioned, but also as protective, framing the state as a guarantor of fairness, stability, and prosperity. Culturally, the Neo-Sumerian period consciously revived Sumerian language and tradition. Sumerian was reaffirmed as the primary language of administration and religious expression, even as Akkadian remained widely spoken. Scribal schools flourished, preserving classical hymns, royal inscriptions, and literary compositions. This deliberate cultural choice suggests that the revival was not merely political, but also ideological, asserting continuity with an idealized Sumerian past to legitimize present authority. Despite its achievements, the UR3 system carried inherent vulnerabilities. Its heavy reliance on centralized control required constant oversight and surplus production. Any disruption to agricultural output, trade routes, or administrative cohesion placed severe strain on the system. Over time, pressures from Amorite groups, Elamite incursions from the east, and internal administrative burdens weakened the state's capacity to respond effectively. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Neo-Sumerian revival came to an end with the fall of Ur to Elamite forces. Yet this period stands as the final moment of independent Sumerian political dominance. It demonstrated that Sumerian civilization could adapt, reorganize, and reassert itself under favorable conditions, even after apparent collapse. The administrative models, legal concepts, and cultural practices refined during the UR3 period would continue to influence Mesopotamian states long after Sumer itself ceased to exist as a political entity, forming a bridge between ancient city-states and later imperial systems. With the collapse of the UR3 state around 2004 BCE, Sumerian political independence came to a definitive end. What followed was not abrupt cultural extinction, but gradual and systematic integration into emerging Babylonian civilization. Power shifted northward to cities such as Isin, Larsa, and ultimately Babylon, where new dynasties consolidated control over southern Mesopotamia. These rulers inherited a landscape already shaped by millennia of Sumerian experimentation in agriculture, administration, and urban organization, and they adapted this inheritance to new political realities. Linguistic evidence provides one of the clearest indicators of final integration. During the early 2nd millennium BCE, Sumerian ceased to function as a spoken language in daily life. Akkadian dialects, particularly Old Babylonian, became dominant in administration and communication. However, Sumerian did not disappear. Instead, it was preserved as a classical and liturgical language, comparable in function to Latin in medieval Europe. Scribal schools continued to teach Sumerian grammar, vocabulary, and canonical texts, ensuring that its intellectual traditions remained embedded in Babylonian education. Babylonian law, governance, and religion also reflect deep Sumerian foundations. Legal concepts developed under earlier Sumerian and Neo-Sumerian regimes informed later law codes, including the Code of Hammurabi. Although these laws were written in Akkadian, their structure, assumptions about social order, and emphasis on state-regulated justice reveal clear continuity. Administrative practices such as land measurement, labor obligations, and standardized accounting methods likewise evolved from Sumerian precedents rather than replacing them. Religious integration was particularly thorough. Babylonian theology absorbed Sumerian deities, myths, and ritual practices, often reinterpreting them within new frameworks. Gods such as Enlil, Inanna, and Enki retained prominent roles, even as Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, rose to supremacy. Many Babylonian myths were reworked versions of earlier Sumerian compositions, translated and adapted to suit new political contexts. This process allowed Babylonian rulers to claim legitimacy by positioning themselves as heirs to an ancient sacred order rather than innovators breaking from tradition. Material culture further demonstrates continuity through transformation. Urban layouts, temple architecture, and everyday technologies remained consistent with earlier Sumerian models. Innovations occurred gradually, layered onto existing systems rather than replacing them. This continuity helped stabilize society during periods of political transition and reinforced the sense that Babylonian civilization was an extension of Mesopotamian heritage rather than a departure from it. A key historical insight from this phase is that civilizations do not end solely through conquest or collapse. Instead, they often dissolve into successor cultures, transferring knowledge, values, and institutional frameworks. In the case of Sumer, its integration into Babylonian civilization was facilitated by the practicality and durability of its systems. Babylonian rulers adopted what worked, modified what needed adjustment, and preserved what conferred legitimacy and continuity. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, Sumer no longer existed as a distinct political or ethnic identity. Yet its influence remained pervasive. The foundations of Mesopotamian science, law, religion, and administration continued to reflect Sumerian origins, even when their creators no longer identified as Sumerian. This final integration marked not an end, but a transformation, ensuring that Sumer's contributions endured within the broader current of ancient Near Eastern civilization. Through this process, Sumer's ideas outlived its politics, shaping societies that followed long after its name faded from common use. The legacy of the Sumerians is not confined to a single invention or moment of innovation, but rather lies in a cumulative framework that shaped how complex societies functioned thereafter. Among their most enduring contributions was the development of writing. Beginning as a practical system of record-keeping around the late 4th millennium BCE, cuneiform writing enabled the administration of labor, taxation, trade, and property. Over time, this system expanded beyond accounting to include laws, prayers, scientific observations, and literary compositions. Writing transformed memory into an external, durable system, allowing institutions to operate across generations rather than relying solely on oral transmission. Closely connected to writing was the Sumerian contribution to law and governance. Early legal formulations, most clearly preserved in the laws attributed to Uarnemu, introduced the principle that social order could be regulated through standardized rules enforced by the state. These laws addressed issues such as property damage, personal injury, labor obligations, and social status. While later Mesopotamian law codes refined these ideas, the underlying assumption that justice was a matter of public administration rather than private retaliation can be traced to Sumerian practice. Urbanism represents another foundational legacy. Sumerian cities such as Uruk, Uar, and Lagash established enduring models of urban organization. These cities integrated residential quarters, temples, workshops, storage facilities, and administrative centers within defined boundaries. Urban life depended on coordinated infrastructure, including irrigation canals, roads, and defensive walls. This arrangement demonstrated that dense populations could be sustained through planned management of resources, labor, and space. Later civilizations across Mesopotamia and beyond adopted similar urban principles, adapting them to new environments. In science and mathematics, Sumerian innovations continue to shape modern systems in subtle ways. Their use of a sexagesimal, or base 60, numerical system underlies contemporary measurements of time and angles. Astronomical observations recorded by Sumerian scribes contributed to early calendrical systems, which regulated agricultural cycles and religious festivals. Medical texts reveal an empirical approach to diagnosis and treatment, combining observation with ritual practice. Although limited by the scientific knowledge of their era, these efforts reflect an early commitment to systematic inquiry. Technological contributions extended into everyday life. The Sumerians standardized tools, weights, and measures, facilitating trade across long distances. They refined pottery production, metallurgy, and textile manufacturing, embedding craft specialization into the economic structure. The wheel, widely associated with Mesopotamia, revolutionized transport and production, increasing efficiency in agriculture and commerce. These technologies were not isolated inventions, but parts of integrated systems that supported urban economies. An important insight is that Sumerian contributions were rarely abstract innovations detached from social needs. Each development emerged in response to practical challenges, managing surplus, coordinating labor, resolving disputes, or predicting seasonal change. Their significance lies in how these solutions became institutionalized, forming repeatable patterns that others could adopt and adapt. By reviewing writing, law, urban organization, and scientific thought together, it becomes clear that Sumerian civilization provided a structural template for later societies. These contributions did not remain static. They were modified by Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and other cultures. Yet the foundational concepts endured, shaping how power was exercised, knowledge preserved, and communities organized. This broader influence prepares the way for examining how Sumer's legacy extended beyond inventions alone, influencing cultural memory, education, and historical consciousness across the ancient world. For much of human history, Sumer existed only indirectly in memory, preserved through fragments embedded in later Mesopotamian traditions and biblical narratives. After the decline of cuneiform literacy in the 1st century CE, the Sumerians themselves vanished from recorded awareness. Their cities eroded into mounds of earth, their language fell silent, and their contributions were attributed to vaguely defined ancient peoples. It was not until the modern era that Sumer reemerged as a distinct civilization through the systematic study of archaeology and ancient writing. The rediscovery of Sumer began in the 19th century with European exploration of the Near East. Early travelers and antiquarians encountered massive ruins along the Tigris and Euphrates, but initially lacked the tools to interpret them. Excavations at sites such as Uruk, Uar, and Lagash revealed layers of occupation far older than those associated with Assyria or Babylon. These findings challenged prevailing assumptions about the origins of civilization and suggested the existence of an earlier, foundational culture. A decisive breakthrough came with the decipherment of cuneiform. Initially, scholars assumed that all cuneiform texts represented early forms of known Semitic languages. However, as more tablets were studied, researchers identified a distinct, non-Semitic language underlying many of the earliest texts. By the late 19th century, this language was recognized as Sumerian. The realization that Sumerian was unrelated to Akkadian fundamentally altered understanding of Mesopotamian history, revealing a deep and previously unknown cultural stratum. Archaeological methodology further refined this picture. Stratigraphic excavation allowed scholars to establish relative chronologies, while advances in dating techniques clarified the sequence of cultural development. Administrative tablets, temple inscriptions, and everyday records provided insight not only into elite activities, but also into agriculture, labor, and domestic life. Sumer was no longer an abstract precursor, but a complex society reconstructed through material and textual evidence. An important insight from this rediscovery is how easily civilizations can disappear from historical consciousness without continuous textual transmission. Unlike Greece or Rome, whose classical texts were copied and studied across centuries, Sumer left no living literary tradition. Its writing system fell out of use, and later societies adapted its myths without preserving attribution. As a result, Sumer's influence persisted even as its identity faded. The modern recovery of Sumer has reshaped broader narratives of human history. It shifted the perceived origins of cities, writing, and state institutions thousands of years earlier than previously believed. Sumer became central to discussions of how and why complex societies emerge, influencing disciplines ranging from archaeology and anthropology to economics and political theory. By reconstructing Sumer through excavation and decipherment, modern scholarship restored a missing chapter of the human past. This process also highlighted the provisional nature of historical knowledge, dependent on material survival and interpretive frameworks. As research continues, new discoveries and methods refine understanding. demonstrating that Sumer's story is not closed but continually re-examined. This evolving scholarship leads naturally to a final consideration of why Sumer remains relevant today, not only as an ancient civilization, but as a case study in the origins and durability of human social organization. Sumer still matters because it represents the earliest sustained experiment in large-scale human organization, and its successes and failures illuminate patterns that continue to shape societies today. As the first civilization to leave extensive written records, Sumer provides a rare opportunity to examine how complex institutions emerged from environmental pressure, demographic growth, and technological innovation. Its history shows that civilization was not an inevitable outcome, but the result of repeated problem-solving in response to specific constraints. One of Sumer's most enduring lessons lies in the relationship between environment and human agency. Faced with unpredictable rivers and arid conditions, Sumerian communities engineered irrigation systems that transformed the landscape. These systems enabled surplus production and urban growth, but also introduced long-term ecological stress, including soil salinization. This trajectory illustrates a recurring historical pattern. Technological solutions can generate prosperity while simultaneously creating new vulnerabilities. Sumer demonstrates that environmental management is inseparable from political and social organization. Sumer also matters as a case study in institutional innovation. Its temples, palaces, and administrative systems coordinated labor and resources on an unprecedented scale. Writing, accounting, and standardized law emerged not as abstract achievements, but as tools to manage complexity. These developments reveal how bureaucracy arises from practical necessity and how it can both stabilize and constrain societies. The detailed administrative records of Sumer allow modern observers to see the mechanics of early governance with unusual clarity. Equally significant are the limits exposed by Sumerian experience. Political fragmentation, competition over resources, and reliance on rigid centralized systems left Sumer vulnerable to internal strain and external pressure. Despite remarkable cultural resilience, its city-states repeatedly struggled to maintain unity and adapt to changing conditions. This aspect of Sumer's history underscores that innovation alone does not guarantee long-term stability. Flexibility and inclusiveness are equally critical. Culturally, Sumer illustrates how ideas outlast political structures. Even after Sumer ceased to exist as an independent entity, its language, myths, legal concepts, and scientific practices shaped successor civilizations. This continuity challenges simplistic notions of rise and fall, suggesting instead that civilizations transform, transmit, and recombine knowledge across generations. Sumer's influence persisted precisely because later societies found its solutions useful and adaptable. For modern audiences, Sumer offers a deep-time perspective on familiar challenges: managing resources, organizing labor, legitimizing authority, and balancing growth with sustainability. Its history encourages reflection on how societies respond to success and stress, and how unintended consequences emerge from well-intentioned innovation. Studying Sumer is not about finding direct answers to contemporary problems, but about recognizing enduring patterns in human behavior and institutional development. By examining Sumer as a whole, from its environmental foundations to its long legacy, the narrative of this civilization becomes inseparable from the broader story of civilization itself. It marks the point at which human societies began to document their choices, measure their world, and organize collective life at scale. In doing so, Sumer provides not only the earliest chapter of recorded history, but also a lasting framework for understanding how civilizations are built, sustained, and ultimately transformed.